Welcome to Dangerous Wisdom, a journey into mystery and a gateway to the mind of nature and the nature of mind. This is Dr. Nikos, your friendly neighborhood soul doctor, happy to be here with you so that together we can create a culture of wisdom, love, and beauty. Auspicious interbeing to you and yours, my friends, and Koinos Hermes. I am super excited, super, emphasis on super excited, Oprah level excited about our guest today. And you'll see why very soon. I'm going to read his intro. This is Dr. Jeffrey J. Kripal. He is the Associate Dean of the School of Humanities and holds the J. Newton Razor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought. I love that there's a razor there. It's not the same kind of razor, but it's okay. He is over at Rice University, where he chaired the Department of Religion for 8 years and helped create the GEM program, a doctoral concentration in the study of Gnosticism, esotericism, and mysticism. That's the GEM, and is the largest program of its kind in the world. He presently helps direct the Center for Theory and Research at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, just south of where I'm at here in the Maxa Reja, the Santa Cruz Mountains. He served as the chair of the board there from 2015 to 2020. That is quite the special place. For those of you who are in the know, you know that. Those of you who aren't, look it up. Jeff is the author or co-author of 12 books, 8 of which are with the University of Chicago Press. He has also served as the editor-in-chief of the Macmillan Handbook series on religion, 10 volumes from 2015 to 2016. Jeff specializes in the study of extreme religious states and the revisioning of a new comparativism, particularly as both involve putting the impossible, in quotes, the impossible, the supposedly impossible, back on the academic table again. We could say the cultural table as well. He is presently working on a 3-volume study of paranormal currents in the history of religions and the sciences, Jeff, and the philosophies. For the University of Chicago Press, collectively entitled The Super Story. We've had the over story. Now we're going to get the super story. Jeff Kripal, welcome to Dangerous Wisdom.
Thanks, Nikos. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I am super happy to have you here because I've actually known about your work for some time. And because I can say this because she was very public about working with me, but a client of mine, Sarah Beek, I don't know if you remember her from your time at Harvard.
Oh, yeah, sure, of
Yeah.
course.
She, of course, spoke very glowingly about you and your work. And then it took me a very long time to get to it. And then I finally read The Supernatural, which is a delightful book. Everybody run out and get that one too. The Supernatural is so good. And I just love how skillful you and Whitley Strieber were and how you handled. And it's very relevant now because it is about, loosely speaking, UFO phenomena. And then I knew when I started the podcast, I really want to get Jeff Kripal, man. I got to talk to this guy. Feels like a soul brother. And I wasn't going to read the Superhumanities. And I was hoping maybe you would even recommend something else to read because I thought I'm just going to feel like I'm in an echo chamber. I had this feeling that it was just going to feel so much like my own limited work in academia. And it was, and it wasn't. I mean, this is the book, everybody, The Superhumanities. And you definitely handle these things in your own totally unique and awesome way. It's 50 flavors of awesome, really. It's really great. And the thing about it is, I read it as a little bit like a love letter to humanity and to the humanities. And the love letter says what a lover might say to their beloved: you are super, more super than you even realize. And then at the same time, it's like an open letter to the professors, an open letter asking a question: what would happen if we were to put the super back on the table, as you say? And what cultural possibilities and what possibilities for individuals as well would open up? Does that sound like a reasonable characterization of you?
It sounds like you should have written the back, certainly the back cover copy, maybe the book, Nikos. I mean, that's a beautiful summary of the book, actually, and it very much is a love letter. I mean, that's certainly how it was intended.
Yeah, that's how it comes across, and I really really appreciate it. And it's this revisioning. It's funny because my dissertation was called "The Revisioning of Philosophy" and was so similar. We did a lot of similar moves. We drew from Nietzsche, of course, and drew from examples of the supposedly super. And you draw from religion in particular. And you say in the book that the superhuman precedes the human. I
Mhm.
really like that way of getting at it. Can you elaborate that a little bit? The superhuman precedes the human.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean that both ontologically, but also historically. You know, the idea of the human, of course, is fairly modern. Humanism is generally seen as something that came about over the last few hundred years, and I think most of us, at least living in this culture, assume that the human is a natural social animal that lives entirely in a kind of social plane. And what I mean by the phrase "the superhuman precedes the human" is that that's not how our ancestors thought of the human. I mean, they assumed that we came from somewhere else and that there were all of these transcendent components or dimensions to us, and that yes, we live these social biological lives, but that's only a part of who we actually are. So that's what I mean by it historically. I mean, ontologically, I think we emerge from this other realm or this other world, and that this does pre pre-exist us, and probably post-exist us to slaughter the English language.
No, that's the beauty of English. It allows for these things, right?
Yeah,
I've grown to appreciate English more than I used to. So this is really interesting. Ontologically, of course, some people might be new to that word, and we're talking about the beingness, that there's something, some kind of super ground from which
yeah,
we emerge, which we are in some sense identical with, and then into which we will go on, and which from which we might evolve as well, that there might be a change in us. This is very much like the Marvel comic line, right? The human beings are evolving into the super. And maybe we can get to, well, it's okay. Why don't we touch on Nietzsche's tightrope there? Because I love that you talk so much about Nietzsche. I really love Nietzsche a lot. And so what would it do? That is the story that we sometimes get in the Marvel comics, that human beings are evolving and then there are these new mutants emerging and they have powers.
right.
And Nietzsche really has this idea. Would you like to just go rap on Nietzsche, brother? Let's
Yeah, I mean, so let me wrap on that whole thing. I mean, just to kind of go back a bit, in the early part of the millennium, I wrote this book called Esalen, America and the Religion of No Religion. And it was about the Institute, down the road from you. But it was really about the whole American counterculture and the rise of a lot of contemporary esoteric or alternative movements. And one of them was, as I was finishing that book, how old was I? I was I was 45 actually as I finished that book. And I found myself becoming obsessed with the X-Men, who, by the way, I was not obsessed with as a kid. I was a Spider-Man guy. And the X-Men were like this B-level kind of series that didn't really mean much. It was kind of hokey. And I was like, why am I so obsessed with the X-Men? I was kind of embarrassing. I called it my midlife regression. And I realized, though, that the human potential idea, which is essentially that there's this immense potential that human beings have, and that parapsychological or paranormal experiences are sort of buds or beginnings of some kind of evolutionary advance. I realized that that's essentially the X-Men story, and that there's this weird kind of resonance between the human potential movement that really developed in California in the early 60s and this New York adolescent comic book story that developed at the exact same time, by the way, on the other coast. And I hadn't really read Nietzsche yet, to be honest. I read Nietzsche later because of some grad students, and I realized this was our stuff. I mean, and by our stuff, I mean this is the humanist. There's nobody more central to the humanities than Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche was basically a mutant and was talking about this evolutionary advance and the Ubermensch or the superhuman 150, 140 years ago, I guess. And so I wrote this chapter called "The X-Men Before Their Time," and essentially what I argued is that actually this basic mythos, this idea of evolving superhumans, is very old, and it goes back to Nietzsche. Actually, it's not a Marvel Comics idea. I mean, they took it very late and of course developed it in their own way, but it's basically ours, and it's Nietzschean through and through. Um, and that's why when you watch the Marvel movies, I mean, a figure like Magneto, for you Marvelites out there, a figure like Magneto is Friedrich Nietzsche. I mean, you want Friedrich Nietzsche? That's Friedrich Nietzsche. Magneto is Friedrich Nietzsche. And I don't see how you can watch those movies having read your Nietzsche and not see that. I mean, it's just to me mind-boggling that more people don't say that and see that.
Well, this is part of the marginalization of philosophy in the culture, I would say. Now, I would agree with you that there is this weird demarcation problem that I realize, because I very nearly I thought it would be such a great thing to come down to Rice and hang out with you and Anne Klein. So I nearly applied to your department. But I had this little bit of resistance that you were in a department of religion. And I
Yeah.
realized that there is this, just like in science, I'm referring to this thing in a technical way, the demarcation problem. The scientists are, and the philosophers of science are obsessed with the demarcation between science and pseudoscience. And then I realized, well, there's one between philosophy and religion, and
Oh
it's a
yeah.
weird one. And the way you approach religion is that it is concerned with the big questions that you would
Oh
think
yeah.
would belong, what really am I? What's the nature of reality? What happens when I die? How then shall I live? And so I think that's really beautiful. But these things are marginalized because religion then is this caricature of itself in the culture, and so is philosophy. This, how many grains are in a heap, is what philosophy is. And it's because these things are dangerous. That's where the dangerous wisdom comes from. So dangerous wisdom is about how those deep currents, the things that you are talking about included, are dangerous, because if we really valued our superness, we'd be less interested in Ferraris and Amazon and Netflix. I mean, if you can be an X-Man, why would you want you would do something different? But maybe we could talk about this, what you call the promise of religion, and sort of like the secret and the secret logic of religion, that there are these two poles that you talk about, which I would refer to as arts of awareness. You say extreme asceticism, but I would say these are arts of awareness, or techniques of maybe technologies of being, if we could recover the word technology. I don't really go in the Foucault direction because he's just too limited. And then the other pole are these anomalous experiences that belong to the philosophical and religious traditions. Can you talk about that? The promise of religion, the secret of religion, those two poles, and how that plays into your book and our culture.
Yeah. I mean, again, just to back up a bit, I mean, I think this demarcation problem you're referring to, philosophy has gone in a very Anglo analytic direction in the humanities. And so we're allowed to talk about truth statements and kind of stay on the surface of things, but any kind of deep, kind of ultimate questioning is certainly off the table today in these analytic departments. And so I think the concern you were picking up is a real one.
It's also true, though, in the Continental, they've gotten caught in the problem of critique, which we won't go into, but I don't find it to be much more exhilarating. Okay, it's
No,
still depressing, but anyway, please
it
continue.
is depressing, but it's because the inheritor of Nietzsche became Foucault instead of George Bataille,
Yeah.
as I say, and they lost the mystical, they lost the ontological, and everything just becomes a language game. And anyway, that's this nerdy philosophical conversation. Your question really, so when I talk about the promise of salvation, I'm quoting Martin Riesbrodt, was a German sociologist of religion, and I'm not talking about a specific religion. I'm not a religious person, and that you should believe X, Y, and Z. But I think the whole history of religions, from a kind of comparative sweep, gives a very clear witness to this superhuman nature. And the way you manifest our superhumanity it's not by being a nice person and living a healthy, happy life. It's actually, you know, asceticism. It's a discipline. You discipline the body and the mind, and perhaps something goes horribly wrong in your life, and it's in these moments of ascetic or traumatic margin or gap that this superhumanity manifests itself. And that's the promise of salvation for Riesbrod, is that you don't actually get to the salvific expansion of consciousness except through these intense ascetic regimes that are really mimicking, I think, these traumatic moments that happen spontaneously. So, for example, to give you a Christian example, I mean, I think a lot of listeners come from a Christian background. You know, the resurrection is this anomalous kind of mystical moment that does not happen without the trauma of the crucifixion and this horrible suffering. And that was the key to a lot of medieval mystical piety as well, is you don't get to the mystical experience except through the suffering, except through the celibacy and the obedience and the ascetic behavior. And that's so not cool today. I mean, people want to be healthy and happy and whole, and that just kind of flattens out the human into this social animal that I think is part of our depression or part of our problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot of nuance there, though, because but first of all, I want to return to that because that gets into, I think, a very interesting thread, and there's a lot of nuance. What we're saying, though, and what I kind of getting from the book is we should be clear that religion, in the deep sense you're talking about, it's not, or at least not restricted to history, society, reason, politics, economics, but it doesn't exist without this superness. And then the humanities, as we understand them, so what our culture does a lot of is metaphysical policing. We won't allow this, we won't allow that. And so these things that are central to the philosophical and religious traditions of the world, and also broader, the arts, that the artists get pulled in, but what we think of broadly as the humanities, we don't get to understand our humanness or the nature of reality if we exclude these. And this is part of the problem that we're facing.
No, and that which we exclude is precisely that which means the most. And so, of course, we're in a moment of depression. And, one of the things I often think about is the origin source of the academy, of course, is the academia, the grove outside of Athens where Plato taught. And the key to a lot of Plato's thinking was the parable of the cave, and it's the idea that you actually don't trust the senses, you don't trust human reason as just human reason. Somebody has to be yanked out of the chains, out of the cave, and put up into the sunlight, and then comes back. And of course, none of the cave dwellers believe the person. So there's a very distinct sense of two levels of truth. There's the level in the cave and the shadows, and then there's the level of the light outside, and they don't go together so well. And to me, that's the origin point of the humanities, is that sort of mystical sense of immanence and transcendence. And what we've done is we've just cut off the sunlight, right? We've just cut off the transcendence, and it's all immanence now. And we're stuck in the cave essentially.
And this is part of the big problem, why this is so important for those of you listening. This is so important for our culture right now, because as you point out, some of the best ideas, the most vitalizing, the most world-changing ideas have come from people working with this kind of polarity.
Yeah.
How do I educate myself? Because I think I would call it educate, but you could say discipline oneself, so that this superness can come through. And given the scale of the problems we face, we need super ideas. We don't need more of the same, which they seem super because, Elon Musk says it's super and he's going to launch a rocket to show us how super he is. But those are not truly super ideas, because he doesn't have this same kind of training, right, that is generally speaking required, although it can happen accidentally, of course, as well.
I guess, what I mean, so you can read the Superhumanities as a love letter, but you can also read it as Crabby Jeff. I'm really crabby about a lot of things in that book, and one of the things I'm so crabby about is why are we ignoring the humanists? Why do we think scientists and people in technology and computers are going to solve everything? I mean, that's nutty. I'm sorry, that's just nutty. And the people with the real questions, and I think with some of the answers, are in fact the humanists and the historians and the anthropologists and the philosophers. But none of those people get hired, Nikos. No, nobody, NASA doesn't hire any anthropologists to talk about the potential of alien life. They just hire more astrophysicists and rocket scientists. I'm like, well, that's not going to go anywhere. Good luck with that. If you want to know what happens when one culture meets another, we'll talk to an anthropologist, talk to a historian. If you want to know about ultimate questions, talk to a philosopher, a real philosopher, not an analytic philosopher, a philosopher. And of course they don't, and they won't. But I can assure you that these scientists and these engineers are talking to humanists and historians, on the side. And they're human beings too, by the way. They know. I mean, I often joke that the sciences are just subdivisions of the humanities. And what I mean by that is I've never met a scientist who wasn't a human being, ever. And I don't know, maybe you have, but I haven't. And so all scientific knowledge is a function of our humanity, all of it, every single bit of it, including all the math, all the technology. It's all human. And that's what I mean by the superhumanities. I don't mean, your undergraduate major in English literature. I mean all of human knowledge is really what I'm intending there.
Yeah. Well, then why did you not stick with the supernatural? So, I mean,
Well,
I know
because
that this book is about the superhumanities, right?
yeah.
But I guess what I'm imagining, like, let's say that Mackenzie Scott says, Kripal, I like the cut of your jib. I'm going to write you a check. Now you can either start the Institute of the Superhumanities, or you could start the Institute of the Supernatural, sort of akin to Princeton's Institute of Advanced Studies. But which one would you choose? Why not stick with the supernatural?
Well, that's a good question. And by the way, when I say the supernatural, we have two spaces in there, right? It's the super and then supernatural. And to me, that's completely different than the supernatural as we normally conceive it. So my supernaturalism, which is really what it is, with that space in there. Look, I mean, I already wrote that book, Nikos. I mean, this is another book, but the other answer is always the Sitzumleben. It's the situation in life of the author. And when I wrote the Superhumanities, certainly when I published it, I had spent 3 years in a dean's office in a school of humanities, and I had watched the politics of the humanities in a school that understands itself primarily in STEM terms, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I deeply admire and love all those disciplines, and I wanted to sort of understand how the humanities fits into this order of knowledge, to use a Foucauldian language. And so I was trying to speak to, this is the love letter part. I was trying to speak to my colleagues about, hey, here's what you have. Here's what your ancestors did. Here's how you can speak to each other. I wasn't talking about the supernaturalism that I wanted to get across with the book with Whitley. So it was a different project, is all I'm saying, Nikos. And, again, it's partly a joke, but both messages were ignored. You always say, with every book, the author, at least I think, I should speak for myself. I think with every book I write, the metaphysical structures of the entire universe shift slightly.
That's right. Absolutely.
But actually, what happens is nothing. It's absolutely nothing. It's just like throwing a Kleenex off the Grand Canyon and listening for an echo. Well, guess what? You don't hear one.
But
So
Nietzsche couldn't sell his books, and look at the influence. I mean, you just touched on that, right? I mean, this is a hugely influential figure who couldn't sell it. He had to self-publish, and it was a mess. And they're really good books. They're also really challenging. And geez, the Superhumanities is very accessible compared to, of course, Nietzsche
I
is kind of accessible on a surface level. He's very demanding ultimately. But so maybe
think,
that's it. Maybe
well,
you're the next Nietzsche, the American Nietzsche.
yeah, yeah, but maybe I have to die. I mean,
Oh
that's
no.
a thought. I mean, I you know, I do think about this a lot. Not dying now. That's another issue. Um, but when I wrote the Estlin book, one of the big questions that people had is, how do we do this again? How do we do the counterculture again? How do we do the beat poets? How do we do the psychedelics? How do we do the rock and roll? How do we do the Asian or Buddhist or Hindu mystical revolution? And my answer was always, well, you don't. You've got to wait. The Germans have this term zeitgeist, and I think it's true. I think it's an absolutely correct intuition that somehow the social surround, the historical context, has to be ready for the ideas, and when those two things meet in a really profound way, there's an explosion. And one of the things that I often point out is that, listen, all of the ideas that became Esalen or the counterculture or the human potential movement, they all existed in the 40s and 50s, all of them. But nobody was listening.
Yeah.
There was no culture to receive them. And what happened in the 60s is a youth culture in different parts of the world suddenly was ready to hear these older men and women talk about these ideas they've been talking about for decades. And suddenly, kapow! And you add some LSD in there, and you add some mescaline, and it just like goes nuts.
Well, we've
And
got that. We've got that part. It's coming. We're having a psychedelic resurgence, aren't we?
yeah, but we don't have the other. We don't.
No.
Maybe we do. Maybe with the climate crisis and the kind of nihilism that's in the culture, the youth generations are ready for something else. I don't know. I don't know, Nikos. I mean, I work with those young people all the time. I think personally, I think that the digital world has had a profoundly negative effect on this. We've talked about this earlier, but it has this sort of distracting kind of effect. And certainly in the 60s and 70s, there wasn't these distractions, and things could be much more focused.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I don't know. That's another question.
there is the question of how we best serve it, because I often point out take a look at these two contrasting icons, Socrates, and these guys illustrate the demarcation problem so well, because Socrates is the iconic philosopher in the dominant culture, and this dude was pretty religious. Now he's put on trial, and he says, you know what, I'm doing a service here, and I think you should give me a free lunch. And they kill him. Now Buddha, who was not very, I really just don't see him as religious. He seems far more philosophical and even more radical as a philosopher in some ways. And Obayesicu writes about this, right? That his version of enlightenment is even bigger or more radical than the Socratic Platonic one. And he says, well, I think you should give me a free lunch, and people do it. And the first universities grow around this movement. And, he gets a following, something he did right. And it was probably a lot to do with the quality of his being, and maybe he wasn't as irritating. I mean, I see him as more awake than Socrates, part of it.
Yeah.
But so this, and I understand, as I was trying to say, this was a nuanced point. It is a nuanced point, whatever, that I understand the context that you're writing. This really needed to, this letter is important to the humanities and to the humans, this love letter. The thing I was just bringing up is that as you're moving the project forward and you're thinking of opening a school of the Superhumanities, why not say the school? Or even like, let's say Mackenzie she said to me, hey, I like this dangerous wisdom stuff, and I've got a couple of universities lined up. You're gonna have your own college with an endowed chair. Now you can have the College of the Superhumanities, or you could have the College of Mountains and Rivers, with an institute of the supernatural, because I love that Kripal. And I say, man, I love me some Kripal too. but I'm trying to get to this idea that as we move forward, is there a way to, because if you have a college of mountains and rivers, then you're going to have ecologists there, but you also should have some artists and poets and other types and philosophers and so on. How can we make sure that we are moving forward in a school that teaches our superness, that says, scientists, you need to come in here, because again, you're not going to get the best ideas with this regular mind. Of course, you think it's such a great mind because you can put rockets on the moon, but that mind is actually not the best mind according to our own traditions. That there are states of consciousness, styles of thinking that are radically different, and you just don't have contact with them.
Yeah, I mean, again, you should write the book, Nikos. I mean, that's the point. I mean, a lot of philosophers of science, I'm sure you read, and historians of science, they'll often point out, I think absolutely correctly, that science is really good at saying how things work. It's the behavior of the natural processes that the science is really good at. But what the natural processes are, they don't have a clue, and they frankly don't care. And it's the philosophers and the humanists who actually care what these things are. And this is the ontological question again. And so I couldn't agree more. I mean, if I had to choose, first of all, I'd probably choose the school of the superhumanities because I think it's cooler. I think it's a cooler phrase. I want to be in a school that teaches people how to be mutants, essentially. I mean, I want to be Professor X, to be really blunt about it.
Yes.
I mean, but who wouldn't? I mean, this is the thing. It's like, oh my God, you want to get these things like inked into the culture. Just do this. So why we don't do that, I don't. It does actually come down to money, by the way, and donors and people funding things and not funding other things. And I'll give you an example, Nikos, and I've talked about this elsewhere, but I had a long conversation once with one of the real leaders of psychedelic research in the country, and people who are given psilocybin in particular often will have a profound mystical experience of the nature of reality. I mean, they'll have an ontological revelation, and it'll blow all their categories. It'll blow their minds. And when I read these psychiatrists writing about it, and they were always psychiatrists, I was like, well, why don't you just hire someone who actually knows something about mystical states? Why do you rely on psychiatrists to tell you? And what the person said to me was, we actually tried to do that, and the grant agency cut it all out. They wouldn't give money to hire anybody but real scientists.
Wow. Yeah, that really shows where we're at.
I think so. This isn't an abstract problem. And I'm not sharing that story. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's an actual problem in our culture that we only value a certain kind of knowledge that is technological or pharmaceutical or scientific. We do not value knowledge that arises from altered states and that involves ontological claims. We simply don't value it.
Yeah. That's also, again, it's the dangerousness of it. It's dangerous. It's threatening to the way that we're kept domesticated.
I think so.
It's
very dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I really think I've said this many times in different episodes and written about it, that we really shouldn't leave science to scientists. That it should be considered silly to run scientific experiments or to do scientific work without including people from the arts and the humanities and ordinary citizens who are just might be living nearby. It just seems that that's the way. It also is part of a more pluralistic science, and you can see very serious discussions of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, science, one of the wonderful things about the sciences is that they're making universal truth claims. They're not talking about the behavior of matter, in Nepal in the 6th century BCE. They're talking about the behavior of matter at the first microseconds of the Big Bang. I mean, oh my God, they're like making massive universal truth claims, and they're doing it really well. And and so I think as humanists, we need to learn from that, and we need to understand that as long as we keep complaining about the localisms and the contextualisms and the constructivisms or this or that, we're just going to be ignored because they're just knocking the socks off of this thing or knocking the ball out of the park, and we're not even up to bat. So that's on us, Nikos, is what I'm trying to say. So
Yeah.
the Superhumanities was a love letter, but it was also a profound complaint about, look, this is actually our fault. We did this. Let's own the problem, because we're not going to resolve this thing until we actually get at what was responsible for it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, the crisis we face is philosophical. I mean, that's how, I mean, I just look at it differently, right? That you have a philosophy of science and you have philosophies running the culture, because for me, philosophy is how we do things.
Yeah.
So if your view of how we do science and the metaphysical assumptions is bad philosophy or limiting, then it's going to be problematic. So yes, absolutely. I really feel that we did this. Let me, in the spirit of comparative religions, let me invoke Festivus. And of course, in Festivus, you have the airing of grievances. So Kripal, I got some problems with you. No, I'm kidding. These are more loving questions.
Okay.
But at one point in the book, you said something, and I haven't had a chance to look at a huge amount of your work, but I saw it at least in one other place that I noticed. Or something similar. I mean, this sentence is unique probably to the Superhumanities, but you said that an abusive jerk can be enlightened. Now, so as a philosopher, that seems to me to be a false claim. And I wonder if this doesn't open up some places where we could, this is very nuanced. This is not easy stuff to talk about, but okay, in what sense does the super actually become its own kind of distraction and confusion? Does it further confusion? Because, so from the standpoint of, let's say if I'm holding up a gold standard like Buddha, okay, and I know he's partly myth, okay, but I like also this touches on Joseph Campbell. He used to say, well, let's not talk about myths, let's talk about a mythology. There has to be a holistic ecology that is metaphoric of human potential. And so what Buddha presents is an education, and he's not alone. There are other traditions. I think Socrates would agree with this too. Socrates would say, look, if you are an abusive jerk and your spiritual community falls apart because you're an abusive jerk, or just in general, people are complaining about it, maybe what you should conclude is you're not enlightened, because the view that Socrates would have is that you do the wrong thing because you don't have wisdom. And Buddha would say the same thing, that you do the wrong thing because you're not wise. And that unfortunately, because especially this is part of our situation, right? We are so spiritually starved that we have like a kind of soul scurvy, and somebody gets a bite of lemon and oh my God, it's an ontological change. And they don't realize that they're completely still malnourished.
Right.
And they really don't understand what they've experienced. They think they do. And they may think that, like, even maybe you have read Hakuin's, the one-hand clapping guy, the great Zen master and philosopher. In his spiritual autobiography, he's really good about identifying this, which the Zen tradition tries so hard. They've got this whole koan curriculum to try to deal with this problem. He said, when I had my first Satori, I thought nobody since Buddha had been so enlightened. I mean, I was the second coming, man. I was Maitreya. And they went around challenging people in Dharma combat, right? Which luckily they had that tradition so you could check yourself. And he kept winning. And so he kept thinking he was enlightened. Right. And then finally he encountered somebody who put him in his place. And then it took him many, many, many years, he said, many, many big Satoris and countless little ones. So I guess what I'm getting at is there's a little bit of separation that I understand how you're separating the ethical, the intentional, and so from the experience. But by isolating the experience, we could get too hooked on it and not realize that it's not as useful if we're not cultivating wisdom in relationship, if it's not an educational process. Can you reflect at all on this and your claim that jerks, abusive jerks, can be enlightened?
I can reflect a lot on it, Nikos, and share with you the reasons for why I wrote that, but also my own doubts and my own struggles. I mean, so I was trained in the 80s and early 90s, and we were just coming out of the the 60s and 70s, frankly. And I was in this comparative study of religion. And a lot of my friends had come out of essentially these guru movements. And they had been touched, I mean, sometimes literally, by the guru and sent into the stratosphere. They had had Kundalini awakenings. They had had enlightenment experiences. They had had all kinds of experiences, sometimes by the literal touch of a guru, or the guru just looks at them. So clearly, clearly the guru is doing something, or at least that was the experience of my friends. Later, these gurus, it was discovered, were also doing other things. They they were having sexual intercourse with some of their disciples, and they were frankly lying about it very often. And I watched my friends, and by friends I really mean friends. I don't mean people I knew. I mean friends. I watched them either affirm the kind of devotional perspective of the community that the guru can't possibly do anything bad because the guru is the guru. And I also saw people who were essentially debunkers saying, well, because the guru did X, Y, or Z, there's nothing to A, B, and C. There's nothing to the teaching. And I was just like, well, both of those things are clearly false. So clearly, the guru is doing amazing things and sending people into these altered states of consciousness, and the guru's doing really bad moral things that we consider really awful and abusive. And both things are true. Can't we just admit, the sort of phenomenology of what's happening here? Do we have to like fall into denial one way or the other? And so, this was my debate with, particularly with a friend named Bill Barnard, and Bill's still teaching. He teaches at SMU, and we published a book together called Crossing Boundaries. And it was really along this debate on whether essentially mystical experiences are moral or immoral or amoral. And the position I took, which was in some ways a rhetorical position, but also an honest one, was that human beings can have mystical experiences in completely amoral contexts, like say a car accident or a heart attack or something, but they can also have mystical experiences because of immoral events like sexual abuse or physical abuse, and they learn to dissociate, and later that these result in these really positive experiences. And Bill took the position I think what's your position, that a truly enlightened state is a profoundly moral state as well, and that you couldn't possibly hurt another human being if you were in such a state. And I've always expressed skepticism about that. It doesn't mean I know that I'm right. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that a truly enlightened state is a truly moral state. But my suspicion is that morality itself is a function of individuality and our social egos. And that if we're in a truly enlightened state that is beyond the person or beyond the social ego, that speaking about morality is not even relevant anymore. And I see this reflected in a lot of figures, including, by the way, Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote a lot about beyond good and evil, by the way, as we both know, and was a misogynist in many ways, and had some views that I think very few of us would want to accept or affirm. But he was still brilliant, and I think he was still enlightened in some ways. And so what I'm trying to say is people can be enlightened in these spiritual ways, and they can also do really bad things, and that those are two completely different levels that can function independently. That's what I'm trying to say.
No, I follow you. I think that this is the place where I feel like there's a fragmentation happening, and
Yeah.
the spirit of what you're pointing to is holism, and the fragmentation is the mystical experience.
Yeah.
A mystical experience isn't enlightenment. You're not fully awake. It's that you have had a glimpse, and again, maybe your ontological doors have been blown off in a certain sense, and it's only to say, look, just don't say you're enlightened. You can say, I've had a huge ontological shift, and now I can do certain things that could help you on your journey, but I'm not enlightened, and I'm not likely to make you enlightened. Like,
Yeah,
wouldn't
I
it
mean,
just be better?
if that's how you want to define enlightenment, then I agree. Of course, that's true. It's just that's actually not what actually happens, though. Historically, I mean, communities claim that so and so is fully enlightened, and so does really bad things,
Right,
and
but
then
that's because
the
he said
tradition
so.
splits.
Right? I mean, this is what I'm trying to get at, is that if Hakuin had not met somebody who was further along in their spiritual life, he would have said, I'm the greatest person since the Buddha. And that's
Right.
what some of these gurus have said.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, the same people we're talking about, because I have some in mind that I think are probably overlapping with some of the ones you have in mind. And that was their claim. I am as enlightened as Buddha. And so
Right.
Hakuin, his spiritual biography is saying, if you don't know any better, and then if you look at his commentary on the koan curriculum, which is the spiritual common law, for those of you, it's sort of like just how we have common law, where there's an instance that illustrates justice so well that we don't have to pass a law. So there's a spiritual common law, these kind of iconic moments that illustrate awakening. He's very clear in his commentary that this is what is going to happen when you have a big satori. You're going to think you know everything. And this is my own experience, even, is that knowing, and not that I went around, because of reading Hakuin and Buddha and Socrates, I really was able to say, okay, this feels huge, but I know I'm not as enlightened as the Buddha. And I don't feel that was some self-limiting in like, no, I really was Magneto and I shut it off. No, I was not. And so somehow or other, if we just have the idea that maybe there's a lot more, and this is the difference too about Buddha, is now, of course, we would never know if Buddha had, this would have all been covered up by now. But certainly it's the case that he offers something that you don't tend to see in these gurus, which is so much information about the nature of the mind, how it works, how you can investigate it, and then medicine for the traumatized people. I mean, this is the guy who invented compassion meditation, which today even our science is saying, wow, that's very amazing. And he did it for people who were having a difficult time. He didn't run around touching people and turning them on. And then there's the dialogue, which I think is maybe relevant to your project. Maybe you do recall reading it, or did you read the dialogue with Kavata? It's
No.
the one where Kavata tells him, he said he's in Nalanda, and he said, Nalanda's a really cool city, Buddha, and people love you here. But you know what would really, really get you a lot more followers, and they would have just even more faith? Get one of your students to do some super stuff. Show some superpowers. And Buddha said, no, I don't have my students run around showing off superpowers. And as it happens in these dialogues, Kavata keeps pressing, Buddha keeps saying no. And then he finally has to explain to this guy. He says, look, there's three kinds of miracles. And one of them, I don't know why he breaks it down this way, but one is telepathy. And the other one is all the other superpowers, all the cities, right? You go to different dimensions, you can split yourself into multiple and come back, all this other crazy stuff that shouldn't be able to happen. And Buddha says, yeah, that's all that stuff. Now, I don't have people do that. And the reason he gives only two reasons. I think one reason is that I think it's a distraction. But he gives the reason that you talk about in your book in relationship to the difference between something that's truly miraculous or not. And that is that people will never believe that the practice of philosophy could give you those cities. They just won't believe it. They'll say it came from a magical plant or a magical amulet. Something made it possible for me to read your mind. And it couldn't be that the practice of philosophy would do that. And so what's the third miracle? The third miracle is an education, a holistic education that teaches you how to proceed in the direction of superness in a way that keeps you in attunement with wisdom, love, and beauty, which somehow he feels are part of the ontological reality. I think that's where the goodness comes in, right? If we suddenly felt that the universe was basically good and love is this energy, right, that's through there, then we might feel that there's a basic goodness that is us and that would have to be the expression of the truly enlightened person. I don't know. Okay. So that's my...
Well, but Nikos, I mean, this conversation we're having is the superhumanities. That's all I'm saying is like, yes. Yeah, I mean, we can agree and disagree about all these different things. And again, I hope you're right. I hope your vision of things is correct. I'm really just saying, look, people have superhuman states under many conditions, and
Yes,
some
true.
of them are amoral and some of them are immoral. And can we deal with that? Can we deal with that or not? I'm not saying that this is the enlightened or final state or that it
Yes.
should be. But even to have this conversation, you and I have to presume a set of principles that are not presumed in the academy, as we both know.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and the other place I would go if we were, again, we were in a school of superhumanities and we had the opportunity to do this. I do not agree with the religious position that these things should be ignored for the
Hmm.
sake of some contemplative goal. I know that's the shtick. I know that. Listen, I grew up in one of these contemplative traditions, and I read a lot of Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism and Sufism, and you name it. That's virtually always the message. I just disagree with it. I just think it's wrong. And
Mm.
the reason I think it's wrong is I think these extraordinary things happen for a reason. I think
Mm.
they're trying to talk to us, and I think we should listen.
Hmm.
And I think to the extent we ignore them, we do ourselves a great disservice.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean I think they're ultimate, Nikos.
No, well, yes, Jeff, I agree with you. I think, but the nuance there is that they're trying to help balance that problem that we need wisdom to handle them. And the communication might be nothing more than some of the synchronicities in our lives, which are like little kisses from Sophia, wisdom, telling us you're on the right track, just keep going. And the idea is
Right.
that maybe sometimes what happens is I get precognition or I have a big Kundalini awakening. I think I'm so fantastic. And then I'm done. I get to just go
Well,
out and be super.
but the other thing people do is ignore them. And
Yes.
that I think is a big mistake.
Yes.
And I
We,
think this contemplative argument that ignore them because it's not enlightenment or because you need to keep meditating, I just think it's wrong. And
yeah.
I know, again, I know that that's what the traditions say. But I'm not a religious person, Nikos. I'm not a Zen master. I'm not a Sufi teacher, and I don't want to be.
Yeah.
I want to be the crabby, superhumanist who says, "Yeah, but um, and I want to do it in a school that supports that kind of inquiry. That's really the argument.
No, no, I agree with you. And even I think what I'm trying to say is that it's not necessarily just ignore them because these things are often they're used by the students to guide them and by the
Well, the
teachers.
traditions themselves are profoundly hypocritical.
They
Uh,
are, but I think again it's because of the danger, right? Because the issue is that a little bit of wisdom can be very
well,
dangerous.
well,
And
the traditions will say ignore the man behind the curtain, but then they'll tell you story after story after story. I'm like, come on, which is it?
yeah,
And that's what I mean by hypocritical. And
yeah,
a historian of religions or a comparativist can say that. I
yeah,
just said it's fine. That's obvious. But someone within the tradition can't say that. They can't say, the tradition's real hypocritical here. It speaks from both sides of its mouth, but it does. And I don't mean this tradition or that tradition. I mean all of them. And that's what again I mean by the superhumanities is can't we talk about that? And you know what? Maybe this funny Professor Kripal guy, maybe he's just wrong. Maybe he's just full of it on X, Y, and Z. Maybe. I mean, I don't know. I'm just doing the best I can.
mm,
Um, but you're never going to find that out unless we have that conversation.
yeah. No, I agree with you. No, this is, and again, this is loving. This is not real. I'm not trying
No,
to be grumpy with you in return because I
it's okay.
really love what you're doing.
It doesn't
Um,
feel grumpy, but even if it were grumpy, it's fine. That's what
yeah.
that's what the conversation becomes.
Yeah, no. So now I'm not religious either. That's why there was even I was, and it's so great to hear you say that. I didn't, it's not like I thought, oh, this Kripal, he must be really religious that he's in the Department of Religion. But like I'm confessing, I still felt since I felt I was a philosopher, I felt a little weird going to a Department of Religion, even though you and Anne Klein, I think, are so interesting. And so, but let's talk a little bit about how then a person who's not interested in being religious or being a Zen master, how in the world did you wander from a perfectly good American trained humanities guy into crazy. Why are you in the crazy territory? How did this happen?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is just by taking people seriously.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the things I get asked a lot is, well, what is the moral impulse behind all this? And I say, it's just human beings. You're taking their experiences as goads of philosophical reflection. You're
Mm.
not dismissing them. You're not ignoring them. And the common academic speak is, I believe that you believe that,
Yeah.
right? Which is snarky and dismissive to like, I mean, come on.
I
Any,
believe that you believe it.
yeah,
Yeah.
anybody who's had an experience is just going to roll their eyes at that point and go, "Oh my God, that's just a rejection."
Yeah.
And so that's the short answer. The longer answer, Nikos, is, I started out very religious. I was Roman Catholic. I'm very religious today, but I don't have a religion. And what I mean by that is, I want to ask ultimate questions, but I don't think that any particular religion has the answers or has all the answers. Maybe they have part of the answer, maybe not. Maybe we create the answers by being part of the religion. There's this image of we're all walking up the same mountain by different paths. I actually don't think that. I think we're walking up different mountains. But more than that, I think we're actually creating the mountain as we walk up it. So there's a kind of radical um, constructivism that's at the root of my questions. But it's not just constructivism in the Foucauldian sense. It's a kind of ontological claim that we're actually creating these realities as we participate in them and as we walk them, as it were. Um, so in my mind, I'm just a human being asking questions of all of the cultures and religions I know. And I'm not putting one of those religions or cultures, I'm not prioritizing any one of them as having all the answers. And I think that's very simple and very kind of obvious. I also think it's very radical and very dangerous, to go back to your adjective. I think it's profoundly dangerous, because what it essentially means is there is no way and there shouldn't be a way to argue that one human community is better than another human community. Okay, well, but that's the basis of our whole world, and frankly, of all of our religion. All of our religions argue that. They
Yeah.
all do. And all of our nation states argue that, and they build borders and walls and have guns and commit massive violence to support that. So this is incredibly dangerous thing to do, and I don't say that lightly. I don't say that as a rhetoric. I understand that, and I've said for years that our ancestors, ended their lives in prisons and towers and were melted in the market square. Let's be clear about this. Let's not be naive. And you mentioned Socrates. Well, they killed him. Okay? They killed him because he was asking difficult questions that they didn't want to think about. Um, so I don't I don't I don't honor culture or society or anything or anyone here. It's a kind of dangerous kind of inclusivism, as it were.
Mm. Hmm. And so, I mean, we have to somehow be able to get there. There are some non-dualities that might be active there. One, it might be the non-duality of discovery and creation,
Well,
because obviously people don't have the experience that they simply created what they experienced. It's like it has a greater reality. It feels like a discovery. So and then there's a non-duality of the individual and the collective.
well, my joke about non-duality, which by the way I happen to agree with. I mean, I think what I'm arguing is a kind of non-duality, but like the joke is, well, where exactly does reality stop being non-dual?
Hmm.
Is it Pakistan? Is it Afghanistan? Is it Turkey? Like where exactly do things suddenly become different? And of course, my answer is nowhere. It's non-dual all the way through, whether you realize it or not. But again, that's a position that I don't think is commonly articulated.
Yeah. Hmm. So in the present, I mean, it's interesting how much resistance there is to taking there's a razor's edge here in that to use Hakuin again as an example, but
You really like him, don't you?
I love that he's so honest about that. And I love that it seems to fit the experience that when you have these big satoris, I think you really do feel, and it's even my experience too of the psychedelic community is that people work with these medicines. They really feel that this is it. I've experienced ego death. I've had cosmic consciousness, and I don't really see the same. I don't really. I'm sorry. So but there's a razor's edge there of I'm taking your experience seriously because I know I've been there. And at the same time, what Hakuin is saying, we still need to be able to somehow critique each other's experience.
Correct.
So there's some place where I'm taking it seriously, and at the same time, can we say, okay, well, really, really, where's it at, and what are the consequences going to be of that in the world?
Well, this is again the superhumanities. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is the conversation. You're
Yeah.
doing it.
Okay. Let's see. Everybody read the book. You'll be doing it. You're just doing the thing, doing the
but
superhumanities.
not everybody can do it. You can do it, Nikos, because you're trained to do it already, and you want to do it. I'll tell you a story here that I think is helpful. I had a graduate student come to me once. This is, oh God, decade and a half ago, maybe. And this student was really troubled, and his problem was he feared that he just thought whatever he was reading.
Okay.
Okay, that was his concern. And I was like, well, okay, why did you read this book? Well, I wanted to. I thought there was something there. Why didn't you read this other book? Well, I don't think there's. I'm like, so what you're reading is in fact what you think, and you agree with this person because this reflects your own position. It's like, yeah, and I'm like, well, then you're not thinking just whatever you're reading. You're actually reading what you're thinking. It's the other way around, and I think there's a lot of this in our lives is that but the problem, Nikos, is that people don't read anymore.
Uh-huh.
And I mean that quite well. I mean that literally. I mean, they don't read books, and they read internet or social media posts, which are very short and very superficial. They don't read tough thinkers, and I don't mean that universally, of course, but as a general observation, I think it's pretty accurate. And as a result, we can't have these conversations, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, there's a lot of shallowness because I think people do read, but you're right, it's what they read. And as since everybody's got a book, a podcast, and a life coaching practice, there's all this self-publishing that is not at a very, and there too, a lot of that seems to come out of I had a big experience, I know what I'm talking about. Whereas Socrates would say, look, man, I'm not telling anybody what I don't know, I am not wise enough. And our temptation is to say, but look how wise I am.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think a lot. Don't you think? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
No, I'm
don't
good.
you think a lot of the attraction of social media is the illusion that everyone's special and
Oh
that
yeah. Yeah. We want to be paid just for being ourselves.
yeah,
I want to be paid to just be me. And
yeah,
because I'm fantastic.
and because I can publish this, it's somehow true.
Hmm.
And of course, if you're in an academic environment, you're constantly being challenged by your peers. And when you publish something to be critiqued, to be rejected and then to be nuanced. And you're constantly adjusting to whatever your peers are saying to you. And there's a profound respect, I think, certainly in my academic world, for expertise, for professionalism, for training. And there just is none of that I
Yeah.
could see in this social media. Everybody's an expert on everything. I'm like, no, you're not. You don't know anything.
Yeah,
You're
this is the
this
same.
is this
We're
is
back to the same thing, right?
this is dumb. This is really dumb. And I mean, it's just like, oh my God.
But this
I,
is interesting because it is like what you were saying is that we don't want anything too hard. We want a happy life, but happy, there's an equivocation these days because happy is happy. When we say we want to be happy and healthy, that's not what Buddha and Socrates and all the rest and Rumi, they want us to be happy and healthy. They just want us to be truly, profoundly happy and healthy. And they're saying that that's going to take some passion. It's going to challenge you. It's going to
yeah,
feel threatening. That's the other meaning of dangerous wisdom. I want to stay away from anything that's too hard or too deep because it's threatening to the comforts that I have in this life. And that's part of the magnificent bribe that the capitalist system gives you. Look, I'm going to give you a Keurig coffee machine and a Tesla, and you're going to and you can turn on Netflix and you can order stuff and it'll show up at your door. You're like a magician. And all you have to do is shut up and not think too hard, and you be happy and healthy. And you miss the deeper health if you, which is what a true education demands.
well, this was part of the Esalen history. This sort of it was an anti-psychiatry movement, is what it was, and the basic idea was that health, or in your case, happiness, is really just a coordination with whatever the social system is saying. That to be healthy, happy, and wise, as we put it in our easy speak, it's just to say and think whatever the culture says and thinks, and that by definition cannot be wise and will not lead to happiness. It will actually lead to the opposite direction. And but that again is it's literally countercultural to this day to say those sorts of things. But I think that the counterculture had it right, and I think there was something basic about that. There's a downside to that, which will take us in a whole nother direction. Maybe I won't even bring it up, but I mean, there is mental illness is a really tough thing, and um, I'm not talking about that. That isn't what I mean by health and happiness as being superficial. I mean, there are
Yeah.
people who suffer horribly from conditions and states that are just not this. Um, but this notion of happiness, I think, is usually pretty superficial.
Yeah. Yeah. And the culture is taking advantage of that because if you experience some of these states, so first of all, the culture created them and we don't attribute it to as a consequence of the system. We say, I have depression, I have anxiety. And then worse yet is if you have the depression and the thing is that your soul is calling you, for instance, to pursue the super or to truly help the world, but you feel that it's I can't do it, you are going to feel happier if you do something that you think you can accomplish, even if it's that it reduces you to much less of your potential. But I feel that I can do this. I feel I could go to Home Depot every day
Yeah,
or whatever.
yeah. I mean, I guess what I would say to that is, you're not even asking me what I think. I mean, I'm just blabbing, but
No, right.
because of my non-duality, um, it doesn't really matter to me that I've had these experiences or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty dull, Nikos, when it comes right down to it. I'm spiritually dull. I'm a dullard. Um, but it just doesn't matter
Yeah.
because I share in the same basic non-dual nature as people who do have these experiences.
Yeah.
I don't feel special, but I also don't feel any different. And but see, I think living in that bigger world actually matters. And I
Yeah.
think it's what will remove the nihilism and the depression that we face.
Yeah.
And I'll speak to a page in the book that towards the end I talk about Rachel Peterson, actually. So I talk about, and Rachel's a young woman at Harvard who has written about her own psilocybin experiences. And I asked Rachel, I said, well, did the psilocybin cure your depression or not? And she said, well, that's what the pharmaceutical companies wanted to know. And she said, the answer is no, that the psilocybin does not cure depression, but it puts the depression in context. In other words, before the psilocybin, you think that the depression is the only room in the house. After the psilocybin event, you know perfectly well that that's just one little room of this immense house. And so the condition doesn't go away, but it means something entirely different. And that's what I'm talking about. That's that bigger vision of the whole house or of the whole cosmos we just don't have as a culture, as we both know. And I think that's what we need desperately. We need this bigger story in which to contextualize our own sufferings and our own little stories.
Yeah, the super story. I mean, of course, there you have again the open question is what happens when you combine the medicines with training from the wisdom traditions that teach you, because the medicine doesn't teach you how to use your mind differently necessarily, right? So
No.
what the experience I had was dependent on the medicine.
Yeah.
Whereas I think a contemplative would say, look, everything that medicine can do, I have done, or you can learn. You
Well,
really can.
yeah. And
And
again,
then
this
that
is
could
where
change it.
I just differ with the contemplative traditions. I mean, I just think that's not true. I mean,
Mhm.
I think sometimes for a lot of us, psilocybin is like rocket fuel, and the guru or the contemplative teacher can say whatever they want, but it's just not going to happen without the rocket fuel. It's just not going to happen.
Well,
And
maybe, right. Well, it depends on what you mean. You mean never at all, or that I couldn't
for some
have,
for some people, never.
you think never?
Yeah. And
It's
I don't
possible.
think that. I know that. And the reason I know that is because I've read people, well, Houston Smith said that. Houston said, I tried for decades meditating and practicing every contemplative tradition I could. I took a psychedelic like once, Tim Leary gave it to me at Harvard, and boom, there everything was. And he said, wow, this is a whole nother thing. Now, he didn't make the mistake of equating the states with what he called the traits. He
Sure.
did he didn't see that as the ultimate. That wasn't enlightenment to him. So he would agree with you. But what he was, I think, trying to say is, please don't tell me that your your rituals or your meditation techniques can do everything that the mescaline or the LSD or the psilocybin can do, because it's just not true.
Yeah.
It might be true for some people. Some people can sit down and meditate and boom, they're there, right?
Yeah.
But some people can meditate for decades, Nikos, and nothing happens. They just fall asleep.
Yeah. Well, of course, this too is a nuanced thing. I mean, there's so many issues. For one, the experience that Smith would have had would have been inflected by all of his learning and study and the practices. The second is, of course, it's not easy to find. If you're in a culture where you're not rooted in wisdom, love, and beauty, it's not easy then to find a path that will work for you and that is part of your whole life. Because he
Yeah.
didn't start at age 5, he wasn't surrounded by images and so on. And if you chase many rabbits, you might catch none. So if I tried all these, well, as soon as somebody says I tried all these different things, I start to think, well, wait a second, why did you try so many different things? If you happen to be lucky enough to find a vein of practice and teachings that can guide you, I actually do think you can go further. I'm actually, though, not against. I really do think psychedelics have a lot of positive potential. I think they're being limited by not being integrated with the humanities, including the wisdom traditions. I mean, I
Yeah.
think that
Oh, I
people,
agree.
yeah, need to have that
Listen, I
full.
don't have a lot of psychedelic experience either. I'm
Hmm.
not I'm not arguing for the use of psychedelics here.
Yeah,
It's just you were asking me about, well, how's the method work? And well, the way it works is you just take people seriously and you like
yeah,
listen to them, and you put their stories together on a common table, and you don't take things off the table that you're uncomfortable with or that don't agree with whatever your conclusions are.
yeah,
Uh, that's how the superhumanities works
yeah,
or work. And again, we're not doing that.
yeah,
I'm, you and I are doing that right now, but generally that's not how it works in a university or college or institution of higher education. We restrict the human to a very small sliver of itself, right?
yeah.
And we pretend that that's the full human being, and of course it's
Hmm.
not.
Yeah. And that limitation is the thing about that limitation too, is that it keeps us addicted to the pattern of insanity. Because if I mean, we've become physically dependent on the very way of life that is degrading the ecologies that we depend on. And if I don't know my own superness, I'm more scared to leave it because I don't know if I'm strong enough, right? Like what would life be like if I had to leave this thing that I'm so used to that provides me with everything?
And maybe, this is, Alvin Schwartz taught me this. Alvin he's no longer with us. He was a Canadian writer who wrote Superman and Batman comics in the 50s and 60s. And he later wrote two memoirs based on Tibetan Buddhism and Superman and Batman. And Alvin's argument was, or position, was that actually we need Clark Kent. We need to be Clark Kent. And yes, Superman can come flying in at moments that we need Superman, but generally we don't need him and we don't want him, and it's not useful. And it's way better to be Clark Kent. And so Alvin, he really pushed that, by the way, and I was like, yeah, wow, that's quite an argument. But it's really stuck with me over the years. And
Yeah. Yeah, it is an interesting way to think of it. It's of course another way to think of it is that we could get rid of Clark Kent if the Superman was really the way Superman is, because there's the Otto Rank, right, tells us that the defining issue. Why does Superman help the world? It's not because he has superpowers. It's because he decided to be a superhero, and that's what superheroes do. And of course, he could have been a supervillain. He could have just stayed Clark Kent and never put on the. Or then you have examples like Batman, and like you, I don't feel like I'm even Batman. I'm Hong Kong Fooey at best, right? So, but the idea is that there too, the intention, the ethical intention, makes the super person what they are, and it also helps to create the kind of world in which we live, because we could all just
right.
see each other's superness
There's
and be.
this other, yeah, there's this other wonderful moment in again, he wrote two autobiographies, and one on Superman and one on Batman. And the one on Batman is called A Gathering of Selves. And there's this wonderful moment in Alvin's autobiography where this voice tells him that he has to become Bruce Wayne. And Alvin says, well, I can't become Bruce Wayne. Bruce Wayne's a fictional character. And the voice answers back, that's okay, so are you. And it's just like, whoa, 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 whoa. So it kind of pulls the rug right out from under you. And I guess that's what I'm trying to say is it's okay. It's okay to be you, because you're not you anyway. I mean, it's just you're the same non-duality I am.
Yeah. There's an
Um,
anthropologist who wrote something similar about this. He was talking about this, going to meet this shaman, and he found out that sometimes a shaman, when they become a shaman and the spirits come and give the indications, that and it happened to this shaman, that they had been born male, and this is like decades ago, had been born male, but the spirit told them that they had to live as a woman in
yeah.
order to be a shaman, and that they were actually very unhappy about it. They didn't want to have to do this, but that they had to, but that they did it anyway, and even took a husband and lived like that. And that just, if that's what the spirits tell you, then it's like being told, yes, you're going to have to be Bruce Wayne. I don't want to do that. I mean,
It's like a lot of the children who remember previous lives, that there's a lot of gender stuff that goes on in those stories. And, you have women in a past life becoming men in this life and vice versa. And it reminds me of, there's a song called I Am My Own Grandpa. Have you ever heard that?
no.
Basically what happens is this son marries this older woman, and the father of the son marries the older woman's daughter, and so they crisscross, and somehow the guy becomes his own grandpa. And I think of reincarnation models that do similar kinds of things. They just totally mess up lineages and our sense of identity, and I think that's very healthy, actually. I
Yeah.
think that's what we need. But we don't have anything like reincarnation models in at least Western theistic culture. I
Yeah.
know there's a lot of communities of immigrant or stable communities now that do. But I think we need those, actually.
Yeah. Well, I want to end by recommending the Superhumanities to everybody, and then maybe we could also, in the spirit of looking at experiences that really just seem to demand that we take them seriously. Can you just plug your other two books that you wrote with experiencers? And
Oh, sure.
I can
Yeah.
certainly endorse one of them. The other one I'm looking forward to reading at some point. But
So I did these intentionally, by the way, because I wanted to write books with experiencers. One's with Whitley Strieber, the science fiction writer and author of Communion, which I think is the finest abduction account we have, actually, to this day. It's called The Supernatural, 3 words. It came out in about 2014 or so.
16.
When is it? 15?
16.
Oh, 16. It's basically it's me writing a chapter, and then Whitley, and then Jeff, and then Whitley, and then Jeff, and it's just kind of a back and forth between us. And it's the idea of the book is the study of, well, the humanities has something to say about your experiences, Whitley, and you have something to say about the humanities. So let's see where that goes. And then the other book I wrote after that, it's called Changed in a Flash. I wrote it with a woman here in Houston named Elizabeth Crone, and it's on her near-death experience. She was struck by lightning in 1988 and had a whole series of near-death experiences, and then a sort of parapsychological abilities. And the first half of the book is all Elizabeth talking about her life and her NDE, and the second half of the book is Jeff commenting on that life and the NDE from the perspective of what we do in the humanities.
Yeah. And that one is interesting because my understanding is part of what really calls us to take the experiences seriously is the fact that she was emailing her dreams to herself, right? And so she had timestamps showing that she had seen something and describing the email and then seeing it in the news.
Yeah, and it really comes down to whether you believe Elizabeth or not. I actually got one of my computer scientist colleagues to go to her home, and he ran a bunch of forensic he ran some forensic software on her computer, and basically the conclusion of the forensic analysis was that he couldn't determine that she was telling the truth, but he also couldn't determine that she was not telling the truth. What had happened is she had changed computers so many times that her computers naturally cut off the back computer language that would have been required to determine whether she had actually emailed herself at this time or not. And the computer scientist was just really honest about it. He says, look, we can't tell one way or the other, but we tried. And I actually have had experiences with Elizabeth, she emailing me at a particular hour about an event that she then learns about later. So I have no doubt that Elizabeth is telling me the truth, but I do recognize that that physical proof eludes us, to be blunt about it.
Yeah, as is sometimes the case, or often, it seems more often than not.
I think usually the case.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we have really good data, and I just did an interview with a neuroscientist who reviewed a lot of this data, and you cite people who review the data, that we have some compelling data. But so the experiences are there to be taken seriously, and the question is how we move forward, and that's part of the super story. The super story will help us move forward, I hope.
Well, and those two books are very much about, okay, I'm taking these experiences as goads or calls to think. Let's do it. Let's see how this works.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jeff. This has been really awesome. I wish we had more time, and maybe we'll have you back again. I really enjoyed this so
I'd
much.
love to come back. I'm sorry I can't do this longer. We actually have an attic fan expert coming in a few minutes to look at our attic fan, which is just toast. And
Okay.
it's very, very hot here, by the way. So we need the attic fan.
Oh my goodness. Well, good luck with that. And thanks to all of you for joining us. I again recommend Jeff's books, The Superhumanities, The Supernatural, and the last one again was
Change in a Flash.
Change in a Flash. You can find those wherever books are sold. And if you have any questions, comments, reflections, stories of the supernatural, send them in through dangerouswisdom.org. We might be able to bring some of them into a future contemplation. Until then, this is Dr. Nikos, your friendly neighborhood soul doctor, reminding you that your soul and the soul of the world are not two things. Take good care of them.